Thank you. Well, good morning to you all. We are on our last day, and not, of course, the least, of presentations of senior projects, where the seniors have put all their energies and knowledge and skills acquired through their high school and have chosen something that they are interested, intrigued, want to learn about, and they are going to show us in a project. Today we have Kyle Diaz, who has been with us since third grade. Upon graduation, Kyle is going to attend New Mexico Tech, although he's still undecided in regard to what he's going to pursue. So here I leave you with our Kyle Diaz, and the stage is yours.
All right, cool. Thank you, Mr. Otero, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here. I also want to thank those of you who are watching from YouTube, the whole four of you. There'll be at least four. So thank you for taking the time out of your day to be here. And I guess welcome to my presentation, which I'm titled From Deerskin to Satchel. Now, originally, I had titled this From Buckskin to Satchel, which I thought sounded nicer. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that it didn't appropriately summarize what I actually did for my senior project. So with that, I'm going to explain a little bit about the difference between just just a deerskin and buckskin. So I'll start with deerskin. Deerskin is exactly what it sounds like, the skin of a deer. It's been freshly taken off the deer, not much has changed with it. There's still some flesh and fat attached to it and the hair. It's really not ideal to make things with. Meanwhile, buckskin refers to the product you get at the end of the process of tanning. It obviously doesn't have any flesh or fat. The hair's been all scraped off. It's soft, it's durable, it's breathable, and it's ideal for making clothing out of, or in my case, a satchel. And even though buckskin and leather are made from the same from the same thing, um, they share some qualities, but they're a lot different. Sure, leather and buckskin are both very durable, but leather isn't very breathable, and it's not very light, and it's not very soft. So it's not you can make stuff like belts or shoes out of it, but it's not ideal for making a shirt to wear in the summer. So also, because buckskin refers to specifically the product you get at the end, it doesn't specify to one animal. So you can make buckskin out of anything from an elk to a buffalo, a moose, antelope, any kind of deer, etc. So now that I've gotten that out of the way, I want to talk a little bit about why I decided to do this. So when I started my senior project, I I knew I wanted to make something, and I knew I wanted to learn a process I knew basically nothing about. So originally, I thought it would be really cool to make something like a sword or a shield out of metal. I thought that'd be really fun. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I have no practical day-to-day use for a sword or a shield or anything along those lines. I mean, it's not like I'm gonna butter some toast with a sword. That'd be a bit silly. So that wasn't gonna work, and I was back at square one. So then my dad had mentioned that he knew someone who worked in hide tanning, and I thought this was perfect. It checked all the boxes of what I wanted to do. I could make something, learn a process I knew nothing about, and it was practical. So then in November, my father introduced me to my mentor who would teach me the process of turning a deerskin into a satchel. But before I get to that, I want to mention a little bit of background information. So before clothing was made out of synthetic materials like it was today, or even before it was made out of cotton or wool, people all around the world were using animal skins, anywhere from Russia, Europe, Africa, all of the Americas. Everywhere was doing it. And everywhere had their own unique spin on it. Sure, the general process was the same, but some of the materials differed from place to place. During the process, one of the materials needed is you need some kind of emulsified oil. And I'll talk a little bit more about what emulsified oil is when I get to there, but just know that's important for the process. Now, you can get these emulsified oils from any number of things, anything ranging from egg yolks to jojoba berries to the seeds of the saguaro cactus here in the Southwest. But one material that was common to everywhere that was making buckskins was the brain of the animal. Usually, the brain of the animal has naturally emulsified oils, and everywhere had access to it, which made it really ideal for using every single part of the animal that's been hunted. And this method of using the animal brains became known as brain tanning, which is what I did for my project. I also want to talk a little bit about the different kind of tools from back then and now. Back then, they wouldn't have steel knives, they would use stone knives to skin and scrape the animal hide. And when they were making the clothing, they wouldn't have normal metal awls that we have today, they would have to use bones. And I had enough difficulties, and it took me a long time to make it with modern tools, so the skills required to do it back then must have been a lot higher, and I really applaud them. So on the right here, we have a hole puncher, which is similar to what I used, and a normal pocket knife. And with all that out of the way, we can get to the steps of what I did. And it all begins with step one of skinning the animal. So although I didn't hunt and skin my own animal, my mentor had bought a deer skin of a Rocky Mountain mule deer. However, he also did draw me this diagram here of how I would go about skinning my animal if I hunted it. So it would start with cutting down the belly, and you would also cut the front of the front legs and the rear of the hind legs. If you skin the animal like this, you would get a more square-shaped hide, as shown here. It has more material, and it's just the ideal shape of what you want. If you did it the inverse way, and you cut down the belly, but the back of the front legs and the front of the back legs, you'd get a hide that resembles more of a shape down below, kind of an hourglass, with a lot less material and not the ideal shape. Also, when you're skinning your animal, you have to be careful not to make any dents, well, make too deep of a dent or nick into the skin, because even if you don't cut a hole in the skin by accident, there's a lot of scraping and tearing and not tearing, a lot of scraping and stretching, and any dent might be liable to tear into a hole, and the last thing you want is a golf ball sized hole in the middle of your hide. Also now I think would be a good time to talk a little bit more about the structure of the skin and what I'll be doing to each of the different layers. So the skin can be thought of in essence as these fibers that are tightly woven together. It starts down at the membrane where they aren't as tight, and then it goes into the dermis, which is what's going to be the main part of my buckskin. Sure, there'll still be some, by the end of it, there'll still be some membrane that's on the skin, but it won't be a whole lot. And the epidermis will have been completely scraped off along with the hair. So now, after you skin your animal, what he did was he soaked it in this mixture of wood ash and water. And the purpose of soaking it, and I didn't take any pictures of the vats with the wood ash and water, but the best way I can describe it is like this blackish gray water with all these hides floating around in it. And the reason for this is so that the hide can take up the water and it starts to swell. And the wood ash makes the mixture more alkaline, which will start to break down these glues, as he referred to them as, and I'll be referring to them as, which hold the skin together. So after it's soaked in that mixture for a while, it got to the first step of actual work, which was the fleshing. Now, the point of fleshing, as the name implies, is to get rid of all the flesh, fat, and just nasty things that you wouldn't want to wear. The idea is to drape the hide over this log, and then I was wearing an apron and leaned into the hide to kind of pin it there and got to scraping. And as you can kind of see in the third picture, what I had was a repurposed lawnmower blade, which I was using for scraping. Also, on a side note, I want to point out my mentor in the third picture and my mentor's dog, Ranger, who was patiently waiting by me because the flesh and fat that I scraped off would become his dinner. So, Ranger, everyone. So, after this step took me about 3 hours to finish. It was a bit awkward and not the prettiest thing in the world, but it wasn't awfully difficult. Next, we got to graining. Now, graining was the second most labor-intensive step, and it definitely took me the longest, because in this step, the purpose was to scrape off the epidermis, or the grain, as it's called, along with the hair. Now, this took me the longest for multiple reasons. The first of which being it was during a school week, so I could only really put in 2 hours of work every day before I had to head home. And when I would head home, I would put it back in the mixture of this water and wood ash, and it would stay there overnight or until I got there the next day. So the longer it sits in that mixture, the more it loosens up, which makes it easier to scrape after a few days. However, it also means that hair could just fall out. So I would see a spot without hair, and I would think, oh, I must have scraped here, but I really hadn't. So that definitely took some extra time of just making sure that everywhere I had scraped. Also, another challenge that came with this was the fact that if I left it in that water too long, the hide would begin to rot. And if the hide rots, it's unusable and the work is ruined. So after about a week of going home, working on it, going to my mentors, working on it, going home, going back, I had finished graining. And here's another picture about a day after of my progress. And then the next step was the membraning, which the point of that was simply to loosen up the membrane that was on the other side of the hide, the same side that the flesh was on. Loosen it up, scrape off whatever was too loose to stay on, just so that it wouldn't fall off later in the process and be annoying. And also, instead of scraping it as I had scraped the previous two ways, it was propped up vertically against the tree, and I used a draw knife to scrape it. So before I get to the next step, after this, it had to be rinsed. Because it was sitting so long in this alkaline mixture, it had to be, it had to be kept in running water to bring it back down to neutral. I didn't do this, my mentor did, because there was a creek that was running by his house at the time, so it was easy enough just to stick it in overnight. And now we get to the next step, next steps, which is 5 and 6 of braining and ringing. The reason I put these two kind of together is because they follow each other back and forth. Brain the hide and then ring it out, brain it and then ring it, so on and so forth. So during the braining process is when those emulsified oils from earlier come into play. Now, the reason that's important for them to be emulsified is that an emulsified oil, unlike a normal oil, can actually mix with water. And it's important for it to mix with water because this is the process that will be really rinsing out all of those glues that I mentioned before and leaving just the oil that's been worked into the hide. So in this bucket here, there's a mixture of mashed up elk brain, neat's foot oil, and yucca root. Now, the neat's foot oil isn't emulsified, so the yucca root serves as an emulsifying agent so that everything in the bucket could mix with water. Oh, and there was also water in the bucket. So I would dunk the hide in the bucket, pull it out, stretch it a bit, and just really try and work in the oils, dunk it in, and do that for about 10, 15 minutes. Then I would wring it out. So I would drape it over this stick tied between two trees, state-of-the-art technology, I assure you, and roll it up into the center as if I was rolling up a pant leg or a sleeve. Once I had that, I would stick once it was rolled up, my mentor called that the double donut because that's exactly what it looked like, two donuts on a stick. And so I would stick this larger stick here in the hole and just twist it a bunch to the left, twist it back to the right, and then I would wring out as much water as I could. Then I would turn it about a quarter of the way down and wring it out again, and just repeat this until I had got as much of the water out of there as I could. And then after it was all wrung out, it would go back into the bucket to be rehydrated and to have more oil worked into it, and the process would repeat. Now, the point of doing this so many times is that I can't tell you chemically what's going on, but I do know that the glues that kind of keep everything locked up and hard, when they like to bind to the water. So when the hide is wrung out in this mixture of, well, when the hide is dunked in this mixture of water and oil, the idea is that when it's wrung out, the glues will leave the hide with the water, leaving nothing but the oil. And after all that, I had done it like 4 times in one day, left, and then came back and did it twice another day. I came to the final, well, not final, but almost final step, and the most labor-intensive step, which was the softening. Now, I call this the most labor-intensive step because it was the most work, because what I was doing was hand softening. My hide wasn't big enough to be strung up on a rack, so my job was to, after it had been wrung out, it was still damp, and I had to stretch it and keep the hide moving and keep stretching until the hide had completely dried and evenly dried. If I had failed to stretch like a certain part of the hide enough and I let it dry, maybe most of it would be soft, but then that one part that wasn't stretched would still be hard. And obviously, I don't want any hard bits of the hide in the step called softening. So it was a lot of work. I think it was about 6 hours of just stretching and stretching and stretching. My arms were less than happy at the end of it. But finally, as you can see here, is the finished product of my white buckskin that's been softened. And this is the other method that I had mentioned earlier. What the point of this is to string it up on the rack there, and in essence, you're still stretching it. My bad. But instead of stretching it by hand, you're in essence poking it with a stick to stretch it for hours on end, which is less work, but still doesn't sound fun. And now we can get to the my favorite part of the whole process, which was the smoking. And what the smoking will do is it will allow the hide to get wet again, and I won't have to stretch it until it's dry. Because if it was still white and unsmoked, and I spilled a glass of water on it, and I didn't stretch it out until it dried, it would dry hard, essentially undoing everything, and I'd have to re-soak it all again. So during the smoking, I had stapled my hide together to pretty much form a bag, and then I had stapled it to the skirt. This skirt was attached to the box, attached to a box, and in the box was a bucket of rotten wood that was smoking. Now, the purpose of the skirt is that if there was a flare up in the bucket and the skirt was to catch fire, I would have time to run over and yoink the hide off of the tree and off of the skirt, and I would save the hide. If there wasn't the skirt there, it would go straight to burning the hide and again ruin the work. However, thankfully, nothing like that happened while I was there, so I could just relax in a chair, read a book, and wait about an hour and a half. After the first hour and a half, the inside had become this yellow color, as you can see on the left. And this means that the hide was functionally smoked, but it's by convention that both sides are smoked. So we turned it inside out and smoked it again for another 45 minutes. But then after that, I had my finished buckskin. And then I could have stopped there, but I decided I still had some time to work, so why not make something? So we get to the final step of making the satchel. So to determine how wide my satchel would be, I used the tool of one used pizza box to determine the width, traced out a line along the edges, and cut down the lines. This left me with one large strip of hide, and then the two strips on the side, which is the leftovers. And from those strips on the side, I then cut off two thinner strips of roughly equal width, and those would then be tied together to become the shoulder strap. And then with whatever material I had left over, I cut a bunch of smaller and much thinner strips of hide, which would then be used to tie everything together. So on the left, what I had done was I had folded the main strip partly over itself, but still leaving enough material on the top to function as a lid. Used a hole puncher, similar to the one as used that I showed before, to punch holes in the side, and I tied it all up. However, I also still had the tail from the deer that I had made sure to keep. And because I had kept it for so long, I wanted to use it. So what I had decided to use it for was to cut it off and just tie it to the front of the front of the satchel, my bad. The last thing to finish was the shoulder straps. And my mentor had this ink on standby that I could use to draw anything on the hide. So I wanted to draw a design on the shoulder strap since I felt like that would be the best place to put something. Now I decided on drawing this design, and this was a little test run here, simply because it was easy, hard to mess up, and it was simple enough to repeat. So I had drawn that on the two strips of hide, which would be the shoulder strap, tied them together on the top, and then I cut a slit on both sides, which was then used to tie it to the satchel. And then, at long last, I finally had my satchel, completely finished. And I actually have it here beside me to show off in a moment, but before I do that, I want to say some thank yous. Firstly, I want to thank my mentor, Michael B. Scott, who was just a lot of fun to work with. He taught me a lot, made the whole process really enjoyable, and I definitely wouldn't have made a satchel like this if it weren't for him. I want to thank my academic advisor, Mr. Sharetta, for really working with me throughout the year, answering my questions about the project, and just overall being really helpful, especially with rehearsing. And I also want to thank my dad for both introducing me to my mentor and to encourage me to get a head start in this early in the year, back in November. If I didn't start it then, I probably would have waited a while to say February, and I wouldn't have this satchel to show off. So without further ado, I will put on my satchel now, show it off, maybe pose a little bit, and then we can get to questions. So I don't know how well we can see this, but here it is, my satchel. And yeah, now I suppose we can go to questions. I see Buck.
How long did it take?
Overall, I think it took me something like 25 hours of actual manual work and then another 12 with the rinsing. So that's what, 37 hours, maybe 40. So a long time. And all of that was spread out over a few months. I started back in November, but I didn't finish this until March. So yeah, that's how long it took. Miss Castilla?
Hi, Kyle. I love the satchel and I love your project. Good job.
Thank
My
you.
question is, what happens with the skin if you don't smoke it?
If you don't smoke the skin, then it still works. It's still a soft material and you can still use it. However, if it gets wet again, then you would have to stretch it out until it dries, because if you don't stretch it out, it will dry hard.
I
So
see.
the smoke allows it to get wet and still dry soft.
I see. And
Mhm.
and in what part of the process the skin becomes like a rawhide? Like if you stop the process there, it's a rawhide. It's not a buckskin. Where in the process that happens?
Um, no, good question. I actually didn't anticipate that one.
Mhm.
You know, could you define rawhide?
You know,
Like
like
a
it's really hard.
oh
It's
oh like a
yeah,
leather?
like uh almost like hard paper.
Yeah, I think that's a slightly different process, but
Mm,
it's mostly the same after the graining. So you get rid of most of the hair and you get rid of the flesh, and then believe it soaks in a different kind of
right.
solution for a while, and then it's just allowed to dry.
All right.
So yeah, I saw also
Thank you.
Mr. Oleg.
Excellent presentation, Kyle. Very well done. Thank you. I can empathize. I've tried twice in my life to do my own my own buckskin, one with a goat and one with an elk. I
Mhm.
never was able to get it all completely done. So well done.
Thank you.
My question is, what happens to the smell of the smoke after you smoked the buckskin? How do you get
It
rid of that
it sticks around. Like
smell?
I believe it still smells faintly of smoke even to this day. I
So
actually had to leave it in the garage for a few nights because it would just stink up the entire house.
okay.
Let's see here, Mr. Wenlin.
Bravo, Kyle. What an incredible project. Well done. Um, I was really curious about what went on for you. To the first time you saw the deer skin, the smells, the emotions that you had through each process where you might have just went, ugh, yucky, like, ugh, or like really got into it and felt channeling some sort of primal, like instinct that like I'm doing something that's been done for generations. Like, could you talk about that?
Um, well, when I first met my mentor, we actually got to fleshing the first day. So it's just, okay, you're gonna have this apron, here have this blade, and get to scraping the fat. I'm like, well, here I go. And overall, I don't think I was repulsed by any part of the process, but definitely the part where I was the most, this is less than enjoyable, is when I was really just working it in the oils of the elk brain and whatnot. So yeah, but I think it was overall, it was a good experience overall. So I hope that answers your question. Let's see, I see Yeva. Yeva, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I said, great presentation. I just had a question about, so was there any specific like ceremony or ritual before you skin the animal? Like, is there like a blessing for the animal before you skin it, or?
I'm sure traditionally there is, but as far as modern day hunters go, I don't know of many of them who do some kind of ceremony, but definitely I'm 100% sure that back in the day there would be. I don't know of any personally myself, so I'm sorry I couldn't like give any names or explain
Of
about how
course.
that would go down, but yeah.
That's cool.
Let's see. Okay, Miss Barnard?
Did you really read a book while it was smoking?
Yes, because there was no service out at my mentor's house. So I was reading a book that was also explaining the tanning process. And meanwhile, I was listening to my mentor play the banjo in the background.
Well, I love
So
that image. That's great.
Yeah, it was a sunny day. It was nice. It's great.
Thank you.
So, anyone else? Mm. Oh, I see Mr. Otero. And Mr. Otero, you're muted.
Excellent presentation, Kai. Congratulations. Well done. I wonder if you, since you've been so successful at uh, crafting this satchel, are you going to try to do other things like maybe moccasins or maybe a nice jacket or something like that? Do you have that idea?
My mentor has recently moved out of state, but the next time I get to work with him, I would love to make a vest. I just like vests. Back in 3rd grade, I had this vest I used to wear pretty much every day, so I think it'd be nice to return to that and make a vest for myself, modern day. And then I saw Mr. Shredder.
I actually had the same question.
Oh, cool.
Thanks.
So yeah, vest. Um, okay, I saw. Let's go with Miss Green first, and then Mr. Otero after.
I'm just curious if you know how much something like that would sell for if you were to go into the market for that.
I asked him about this, and it depends on the quality of the hide. So if he makes a poor one, then it sells for less, but it goes by grades, like B grade, C grade, A grade. I don't remember the price specifically that he told me, but I think they can fetch for a few hundred, like the really big ones. And then Mr. Otero again.
I was just piggybacking on the same question I asked. Since you said, I don't know if my mentor will be up to it, but having seen what you've done, I totally believe that you can do it by yourself. I mean, of course, you'll have to improvise,
Mm-hmm.
the shapes for the jacket and all that. Maybe Eva can help you with that since she knows how to make forms for a jacket. But I'm totally confident you can do it by yourself.
Yeah, I probably could. I just have to go out and hunt my deer first and do the rest of it, but probably it'd be a summer project for sure. Okay, Miss Colgate.
Hi, Kyle, that was great. I'm sorry, I came in a bit late. I must have confused the time, but it was really interesting. So the question that I have, maybe you've already talked about it, but how did you get the deer skin?
My mentor had bought it,
Okay.
and he bought it from a hunter
And
up in
are you
Colorado, I
a
believe.
hunter? Could you go out and find your own deer or elk?
I've never been hunting before, so
Okay.
I wouldn't know, but I could learn.
Interesting. Would you be interested in it?
Yeah, definitely.
Huh. Cool.
Miss Barnard.
Maybe you said this. I apologize if you did. And I also didn't say how great it is. So this was a great project. But my question is, how much does the bag weigh? Because when you were hefting it onto your shoulder, it looked like it was actually kind of heavy.
Oh no, I had been working out the day before, so my shoulders are a bit sore, but it's light. I just looked in pain because my shoulders are a bit sore. But so it's really light.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, Mr. Winland.
Yeah, Kyle, I had another question about the process. It seemed like you didn't make any mistakes, and because it looked, beautiful, and you didn't describe any mistakes you made. The braining and ringing looked like a possibility where, you were tweaking the two double donut sticks where you might tear it. But I mean, is there anything that you started working that you were super concerned because your mentor was working with you on that, or you did make a mistake but didn't mention it?
See, during the double donut process specifically of the ringing, I also felt like I was going to tear it during that stage, but it didn't. It's really durable stuff. However, while I was scraping it, there were some holes that showed up along the edge that came from marks with a knife that had cut a little bit too deep. So what we had wound up doing is, because they were small enough holes and I was having a hard time scraping the edges anyway, that what we wound up doing was just cutting it off. So from the whole kind of trim around the hide. So, cool. Anyone else?
Yes. You need something? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.